We all have big dreams, but far too often we never give them a chance to come true. Well, that all changes today. Welcome to Just Keep Learning, where we'll help you develop the right mindset, be more productive, and learn more effectively so you can accomplish anything. Here's your host, Justin at Just Tries.
Our guest today is one of those people who really has it all figured out, but is willing to share that there were many ups and downs. And in reality, do any of us ever have it all figured out? We can see the successes with building a business, podcast, and social media, but it was a grind early on and took a ton of self-reflection and self-care to get there. As a psychologist, he has a lot to share about the battle between mental health and illness that many entrepreneurs face, and he gives us a bunch of great ideas for succeeding in business while maintaining your mind and body along the way. Please welcome to interview 55, Mel.
First off, I want to say thank you so much for doing this episode today, because I know that we're all busy people in the world of creators. I also know that you're a fellow girl dad, and for us, our time is really important, I think is just the best way to say it. So first off, thank you so much for doing this. One of the ways that I like to allow people to start an episode, even though we go into a million different topics, is just a self-introduction, because I really love allowing people to introduce themselves, because a lot of times people tell our stories on social media and online business. So if I were to ask you, who are you and kind of what you do, what would you say?
Great question. So I usually like to start with, I'm a husband. We've been married for 11 years, together for 13. Girl dad, as we shared. So we've got a 4-year-old, and I shared those two things initially because those two identities forced me to think about how I want to design my business, and the things that I focus on are all contingent upon spending as much time I can with my partner and with our daughter and with our friends and families. So by training, I'm a psychologist, so I have a PhD in psychology. And I imagined in 2012 when I got licensed that I would be teaching at a university, working at a counseling center, eventually becoming a training director, probably doing a little bit of private practice on the side. But I took a very different route, and it hasn't been easy. I mean, you know this as a fellow creator, but in many ways I am just so grateful for it, because I feel like I'm honoring the Kid Mel and what the Kid Mel would have wanted. And it's an incredible privilege. And so I specifically work with fellow therapists who are transitioning from clinical work, often in private practice, to online income. And specifically, I focus on online courses and podcasting, because that's the stuff that I've been living and breathing here for the past 8 years.
Right. And you mentioned the Kid Mel and what the Kid Mel would have wanted. I'd love to hear you elaborate on that. If you put that, doesn't need to be overly poetic, but maybe it will be, because talking about our younger selves is a pretty special thing to honor. So when you say that, what do you mean?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I was born in India, and our family's from Kerala, India, which is like the southwesternmost state. And our family immigrated in the late 80s to the US. So practically up until first grade, I lived in India, and the Kid Mel spent a lot of time in India. And, I specifically spent a lot of time with my maternal grandparents, who were both retired teachers. And my grandfather took up farming and raising honeybees and all of this stuff in retirement. And so they lived in this house, and they had a couple of acres, and they planted rubber trees. And I remember picking mushrooms out of this little one section, because it would just get a lot of moisture in that area. I would watch my grandfather, get the actual honeycombs out, put on his whole suit and use this knife to cut the honeycomb to get the fresh honey out, and all of these stories. And so that's what the Kid Mel grew up with, seeing a lot of being out in nature. My grandparents also, they lived when there wasn't proper refrigeration. So I remember they had this back storage room near where my grandma cooked, and it's where they stored grain, and it's also where they had a bunch of tools. And I don't know what motivated them to do this because I think about, having a 4-year-old, but they gave me access to like tools. I mean, it wasn't like hammers, it was like saws and nails and all sorts of stuff. And so, I mean, here I am at like age 4 and 5, like, putting holes into walls, and they didn't seem to care, and making stuff out of wood and sawing stuff. And that's the Kid Mel. Like I have an initial, and there's a picture that my parents sent me fairly recently, and it's me on a step with this like saw. And again, it's not even stuff that we would think about in the US, but literally they had a craftsman come in and make their tools for them. So it was like made out of wood with like this little piece of metal. And here I am like using this saw to like, saw up wood. And the Kid Mel, I think, is imaginative, innovative, doesn't like being, I think, constrained too much. I think like really thrives on creativity. And the interesting thing, Justin, is that like psychology, in many ways, it is a very innovative field. I mean, when I was doing clinical work, I saw hundreds and did thousands of clinical hours where I heard so many stories. I mean, just the range of things, and there's just such a creativity there. But I felt like what was missing in psychology for me was, I don't know, this Kid Mel just couldn't get fully tapped for whatever reason. And so that's what inspired my journey into online business.
Which is really special. And I said it didn't have to be overly poetic, but I think it was, especially when you got into the descriptive words. You mentioned the idea of psychology being innovative. And it's interesting because I too work in, I think it's the largest research mental health hospital in the country here. And I see youth in that building. And I'm not a psychiatrist by trade, although that was a lot of what I did in my undergraduate studies. So we have some similarities there. But I do see people really trying to advance things. Again, it's a research facility, so there's a lot of that work. I completely agree. What I also see is that a lot of the youth who are there really, really, really didn't fit into the regular school system. And that's something I would say darn near 100% of them that are struggling there with mental illness. Really, the kind of mainstream school wasn't for them. All this to say and ask, what was your school journey like for you? Because obviously you did make it through somewhat of a traditional route, even though you were the type that doesn't want to be constrained.
Yeah. I mean, it is kind of this interesting juxtaposition that I walk because, like as I shared earlier, our family immigrated to the US. And so I have a younger sibling, and I remember hearing early on that a big reason why my dad was an attorney in India and my mom was a nurse, and a big reason why they immigrated was just better educational opportunities for my brother and I. So in a weird way, and maybe not a weird way, but I felt like this pressure of I didn't want to mess up, right? I didn't want to fail them because they left aunts and uncles, their own parents, and careers, right, just for our sake. And it was a tremendous amount of pressure looking back, but I think it also forced me to, a weird way, like conform. My original route was I was going to go to med school and go into pediatrics. And then I took OChem and I was like, good gosh, I cannot handle this. Yeah, so I don't know. There was something with psychology, even though, I really thrive on creativity, there was something innovative with psychology. Just the way the mind thinks, just the way, the human experience, right, at the core of it, that was really challenging and fulfilling. And why did I get a PhD? I don't know. Maybe part of it was I didn't want to like disappoint my parents. A part of it was, I don't know, this is probably a whole other conversation, and not to like overly stereotype, but particularly in South Asian communities, what perception of the minimum is very different. My minimum was like a master's degree. And I often wonder about that, like, because I traditionally made it, right? But what happens when you have kids that maybe just not like academically interested or gifted or whatever it is, right? Like what happens in that situation? But yeah, I don't know. In a weird way, like I'm also grateful for it because the PhD has enabled me to have a launching pad. It builds a credibility, right?
Yeah, and that's what was kind of in the back of my mind as you were reflecting on why the PhD. It's really interesting. I feel like I didn't do my PhD I took 2 thesis courses during my master's in education, and in one case, again, focusing on educational psychology. I found myself 3 times sitting in professors' offices who had a ton of credibility and, 30, 40-year careers, who would have been great advisors and mentors, and talking about whether or not I should start my PhD. The last time I was there, actually, my whole thesis, so to speak, idea was that we could teach beyond the classroom walls and that it will improve mental health by finding ways to do so. The edutainment concept, right? So creating, here we go, audio, writing, and film to help students learn instead of sitting in rows in a classroom. Kind of a cliche thing that you see a lot of online business creators talking about these days. But for me, it was very real, and I wanted to study it. So she was very interested. She asked me questions for upwards of an hour. And at the end of the hour, she goes, "You'd be so much better off doing this without me, without these classroom walls." And that was a powerful moment, because this is someone in the institution of university who's like, if you go do this now, instead of all the constraints we have here, you're probably going to be more successful. Hence the podcast. And so this is my version of that. But I did do a lot of school, obviously, having completed the master's, almost starting the PhD. But in terms of the formal piece, it was hard to kind of do both. So that was why I sort of jumped ship, so to speak, in that world of psychology quickly, because I feel like as you continue to grow as a creator, your brand becomes about entrepreneurship, online courses, business, of course, parenting. But I'm sure there's still a part of you that can bring a ton of expertise to people from your psychological background. What are some of the things in that world you think, along with the innovation that's going on, still need to be improved, or things that you learn from psychology that you take with you now as a parent and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, so this area that you're talking about is something that I've been actively thinking about. So I think one immediate area is the intersection of entrepreneurship and mental health. There's that pretty famous study, I think 67 or 72% of entrepreneurs have at some point a diagnosable mental health condition, right? So one of the things I want to speak more, and particularly because for me, I have some pretty significant childhood trauma. I've dealt with depression and anxiety for most of my life. And I want to talk more about that. One, maybe part of it is my own healing, but I think the other part of it is just to normalize that what we see on social media is a glimpse of people's lives. It is not the whole of people's lives. And I think especially those of us who have been doing this for a while, personally for me, I feel like one of the biggest responsibilities that we have toward other creators is to share a more holistic perspective on things, especially when you intersect creator economy, entrepreneurship, mental health. A lot of creators starting out, right? They have these sort of models that they're looking to, but those models, I think many times emphasize the successes, but they don't talk about the compromises that they're making, and they don't talk about what's happening behind the scenes, right? And I think it's an important conversation to have, also related to continuing to destigmatize mental health. I mean, it's just something I feel really passionate about. And, I'm trying to figure out how to talk more about that, because, we're podcasters, right? And great courses. And yeah, I can talk tactics and strategy and stuff that's worked for me. But the hardest thing, Justin, honestly, for me has been when the depression kind of hits, or when I feel like the anxiety is so bad. I didn't record the first episode for almost 4 months. And a part of it was the anxiety kicked up the perfectionism. And I ended up recording that first episode, I think 7 times, because I kept saying, oh, there's an there, there's an there. You're not going to sound credible.
Yeah, at the risk of this becoming a back and forth personal conversation that we need to turn the camera off and stop recording, this is a great example, I suppose, of being vulnerable and leaning into sharing those sides of it. I can relate so much with both the anxiety and depression, especially anxiety, and especially as a teenager, having a panic disorder and panic attacks to as bad as I've seen with the youth that I now work with in the world of struggling with mental illness, and could tell many stories about what that was like. So the main thing that I would like to say is that I don't know if I can say I'm proud of you, but I really appreciate how you have continued to get up and keep going, because I'm sure sometimes it was even more difficult than you can kind of put into words. One of the things for me that's tough when it comes to the vulnerability and sharing is just literally time management when things are a bit of a side hustle, because I am as open a book as they come. And if I had a D-Rock, like a filmmaker, follow me around and asking me prompts, or someone who was creating on my behalf, I was able to share, I'm sure it would be up there with the most authentic and vulnerable that anybody could be. But I find, okay, I can get a post out today. I really want to help people with starting their podcast. And so it's hard to have all of it, you know? One of the things that you mentioned was the idea, though, of anxiety and depression. I think you said mental illness diagnosis when it comes to being an entrepreneur. I'm fascinated by the question whether it's a chicken or an egg challenge as well. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on personality types, entrepreneurship, and how that mixes with mental health.
Yeah, it is truly a chicken or egg. I don't know. I mean, obviously, there's no clear-cut answers on this, but I suspect for a lot of us, we've had some fairly significant childhood trauma where we have felt like we weren't enough and we had to prove ourselves to others. And I think there's something about entrepreneurship that both caters to that sort of rebellious side of us, right? Like the, forget you kind of part. And there's something to entrepreneurship that really energizes us and feels like, we may be able to do this. And yet there's this other side of entrepreneurship or our own past trauma that inevitably intersects and creates doubt and fear and all of these things. Side note from that, I think in generally in entrepreneurship, I'm kind of curious. I'm curious to hear how you think about this. The nature of entrepreneurship is that it is very up and down. And I feel like when you have a very up and down sort of profession with someone that's already has mental health issues or mental health concerns, I just feel like it's a world that you have to delicately walk, For me personally, and I'm not there at all on this, but I'm just coming to the realization that, and I've done a lot of work and I'm doing a lot of work through therapy and brain spotting and all of this stuff on my trauma. And yet I feel like it's so deep ingrained in me that there may be certain things that I can't do that other people can do in terms of entrepreneurship, right? Like, so a practical thing, right? Threads just came out. And everybody's like, get on Threads. And I know it's already really hard for me to do a podcast was really hard. To start writing on LinkedIn this year was hard. YouTube feels extremely vulnerable. And I feel like I'm at my max. Like I can just intuitively tell. And I'm like, I could do Threads, but I know where this is going. This is going to lead to burnout. It's going to lead to bouts of insomnia and all of these things. And is that worth the trade-off? That's the bigger question. It's not about followers or the influence. I mean, and maybe, I don't know, part of this is just the wisdom of, age and also, becoming parents, right? You just have to figure out what you want to prioritize and you have to kind of let go of the fact that you can't do it all.
For sure. For me, a lot of those things, when people ask something like, oh, do you wish you had kind of quote unquote blown up sooner, or that the podcast was more successful earlier, or that you have done more episodes, or you've created more content, you had more followers, all these kinds of things, results oriented thinking. It's maybe just a coping mechanism, but for me, it's definitely super helpful to realize that becoming a parent, and in my case, in a really unique way, having adopted through foster care, which obviously was somewhat sudden as well, and going through the parts of my career that I did and all of these things in early adulthood that prepared me for scenarios that may come up as a social media creator. For me, again, with the mental health struggles, was extremely helpful. I think that it built a foundation to then be able to be vulnerable on top of. And had I done this stuff 15 years ago, I feel like it may have led to way worse than burnout. Who knows? We'll never truly know, but I'm grateful for the, as you put it, wisdom or experiences that have, kind of put me in a position to be able to deal with anything out there, hateful comments or, posting a video and getting 0 views and not feeling like I need to take it down. Being able to create a video and recognize that maybe one person listens or 10 or 10,000, and either way, that's okay. Those sorts of things, I don't feel like I would have been equipped with those tools 15 years ago. And so I'm happy to have started a little bit late. But one thing that I would really like to ask you, and it may be tough to recall or specifically name things, but I know that in some way it will at least be helpful to people. As you put it earlier too, there's no right answers, and I get that. But if you were to explain some of the things that you think help you keep going with anxiety and still being a creator, as you put it, in a field that's very up and down, what are those things that you feel like if we could bottle them or put them in a tutorial that you feel like help you keep going?
Oh, I think a couple of things. So one is, might get a little nerdy really quick, but I literally created an Excel document of my schedule, of my ideal or my dream schedule. And I put the stuff that I wanted to be doing unrelated to entrepreneurship into that first. And then I built entrepreneurship around that. So that was like one thing. And again, that wasn't like an overnight thing. It was like literally I created 2 tabs and I said, this is my current schedule. And then this is my ideal schedule. So practically for me, like that looks like deep work in the mornings, not usually 9 to 12:30ish, assuming kiddo's not sick or something, but just general framework, 9 to 12:30. Then I grab a daily hike at 1 because I feel like there's power when you break up your days like that. And especially as creators, when we're so much in our head trying to think about stuff, I think there's just something about being out in nature. So unless it's like something really like dire, like a blizzard or something, I'm getting out. We have a great park, which is like 4 minutes away. I get about a 2.5-mile loop in for about 45 minutes. I come back, I take a quick shower, a power nap. So I grab my partner is like, you have the habits of like a 90-year-old, like you're 41. And, but I don't know, I grab a daily nap, but part of it is, I notice like it helps keep my anxiety at bay, the combo of the exercise plus the rest.
So how do you define the walk and the hike, but how do you define power nap?
25 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's usually, I can fall asleep now pretty quick, but yeah, 25 minutes is what I usually do.
Falling asleep within 5?
I can fall within 5.
Cool. The reason I ask is because the book Time, I think, is a pretty good book. And I had read that and it talks about the different styles of naps. And I think that's an interesting thing because, some people power nap might be 3 hours and they're waking up drooling and it's going to be pretty hard to get back to start your day. And you hear all these different opinions of, I can't nap because insert reason, right? But so that's why I was curious.
Well, it's funny, the napping thing was, so when we had come to the US, my parents often sent us back to India in the summers, and my grandfather was like very regimented, and he was like, you guys are napping, because it's like 2 boys, he's like, we're taking naps. So he would be like, go lay down over there. So I just like kind of picked it up. But yeah, that's it. And then in the last hour and a half to 2 hours a day is what I call sacred learning time. And so a lot of times it's me learning about the stuff that I'm doing. So currently it's like, I've got a day focused on YouTube, a day focused on podcasting, a day focused on LinkedIn, and a day focused on courses.
So scheduling obviously is a big part of it. Is there anything else beyond scheduling as well?
Yeah. So, there's like a lot of stuff with like nutrition, but like, I don't know, I still feel like I'm figuring out the nutrition part of it, but generally I do like a 16-8 intermittent fasting kind of schedule, at least on the weekdays. Weekends, I tend to, also eat breakfast. But yeah, I would say that's kind of the biggest thing. And then the other thing is I try to so on my hikes, I do a dual thing, which is I realized, I don't know, maybe this has taken me 40 years to realize this, but I don't necessarily need like a number of friends. I'd rather have a couple of friends and have really deep quality relationships with. And so oftentimes on those hikes, I'm actually just catching up with them doing like a 45-minute chat. And that's been wonderful because it allows me, I get the physical exercise, but like at a relational level, that feels just so, it just feels really enriching. And I say all of this and I am, this is a very like sort of neurotypical way of looking at it, right? I'm an HSP, but like for someone, that struggles with ADHD or something, I understand like that kind of a regimented schedule is extremely challenging, So I wanted to acknowledge that too, because, like in our mastermind, we have several of my colleagues that are neurodivergent, and it's like really opening my eyes to the assumptions that I make, even what I share.
I just interviewed someone whose online business he's pivoting away from it a bit right now. So it's not like I'm really plugging it for him. I don't think, and it may not exist by the time this comes out, or maybe it will, because I think it's a pretty cool brand, but it's called the Hogwarts for dyslexia and ADHD. And he's diagnosed with both and has really, worked. I don't know if the right word is maybe struggled, but gone through challenges to become similar to you and I, a creator and a parent, and, juggling life. And so he created basically an online school to help other people doing that. So that's been pretty front of mind for me as well recently. And for me, I don't have an ADHD diagnosis. As I mentioned, my struggles in terms of on paper classical diagnoses were around the panic and anxiety, but I certainly have a lot of similar overlapping, I don't know if symptoms is the right word, but, traits that I always wonder about that. And you see a lot of people getting diagnosed as adults and these sorts of things, but I really feel like, and I wouldn't say this is cliche because I don't hear too many people talk about it, but I've been saying it in job interviews for 20 years, or anytime that people have asked me about education, lesson planning, curriculum, parent advice, whatever it is. So the challenge is that for every one of us, beyond our diagnoses, the answers always scale as much as DNA does. And what I mean by that is that there's always one answer. So if you're asking me about this student who's struggling with behavior, they keep, not wanting to do work, putting their head down, pulling their hoodie up, and you can't engage them, or, another one who just can't leave the gang life because we have to go and meet that actual person and do some learning about them, which I suppose is the whole art of people who do it well, sitting on the couch as a psychologist and that kind of thing. But for me, it always becomes kind of that really individual answer. And when it comes to sitting on the couch, I know that that's part of your brand is the idea of selling the couch and starting that whole blog. So when you made the pivot from, I don't want to say just going to work, because I think for 9-to-5ers, I hate to take away from that when we're talking about becoming creators and entrepreneurs. However, instead of only going to the 9-to-5 and being a psychologist, why did you make the pivot to becoming a business owner?
Yeah. And so the pivot was, I call it my 5-year pivot, right? So I didn't do this overnight. Selling the couch was very much a side gig until the pandemic, when I was down to 1 day of clinical work, just doing testing and assessment at a community mental health agency. And so why did it become a part of my life? I don't know. I just felt probably a couple of things. One is I felt like there was something challenging about online business, and the thought of not trading time for income, which is what I imagine you were taught, what I was taught, right? That felt really challenging. I loved the thought of being at sort of the forefront of education and how we're thinking about work and the purpose of work, and how do we take very specific expertise. And for me, again, just an example, I used to do bariatric surgery, psych evals, right? So any person that's doing a bariatric surgery or considering bariatric surgery has to go through a psych eval, because there's a high comorbidity with eating disorders, any of that kind of stuff, right? And there's also depression, anxiety, all of that stuff. So just a screening for that. And so I don't know, I remember and I haven't developed this course, but I remember sitting there doing these assessments and feeling like I was having the same conversation, right? And the same information. I was sharing it over and over. And so something did peak in me where I was like, you know what? I wonder if there's a way to and I didn't have the word scale, but now I use it, but scale this information. And then there was also a part of me that was like, you know what? There may be people that never step into a therapy room that need help, and how do you sort of serve them? So all of those things kind of converge. And then, the real kind of, we are made up of sort of all of us these seminal events, right? And I had an old supervisor who was, and this is a pretty wild story, but who was the dean of a college turned FBI special agent turned psychologist. and she was doing, she was working at the counseling center, was my supervisor, was doing therapy, but on the weekends was also a sports psychologist. So was doing sports psychology with like amateur and PGA golfers on, like mindset when they're putting and all of this stuff, right? And she told me, like, Mel, you have to see the training that you have as a skill set that can be deployed in other realms besides what you think a psychologist is supposed to do. So this was advice that was given to me in 2009, 2010. As with advice, when we get good advice, like most of us, at least for me, I didn't listen. So I just sat with it. And, but then, in 2015, I was working at a group private practice, and we live in Philadelphia. And there was a nor'easter that came up here in the Northeast, ended up dumping about 30 inches of snow. We didn't have all the telehealth capabilities back then like we do now. So there were down power lines, there were outages everywhere. I mean, there were like sheets of ice everywhere. So I ended up having to cancel about 20 fee-for-service clients that week. And we were saving up for the down payment on our first house. And I realized either I was going to have to go to traditional W-2 employment, which didn't seem appealing, or I was going to continue down this path, or I had to try something differently. And that is where the idea came from for me to start my podcast, my own online course where I teach therapists how to podcast. And then, so that's the gist of it. I mean, I think the biggest shift has been like thinking, instead of like, how do I serve one-to-one? It's like, how do I serve one-to-many?
Because so many of us are doing this, and I reach out to guests through online, social media, on the internet, right? The fastest growing and expanding industry still is the internet right now. And that includes so many different topics. But naturally, so many of us are doing this. And it has it's not that I started my show being like, having a nickname of become your own boss or something to that effect, right? The name of the show is Just Keep Learning. It's around growth mindset. But the reason I started it was because I was working in a jail for youth as well as a school for teen moms. And in both of those cases, again, like I referenced the mental health hospital, youth just did not fit into regular school. In both those cases, they're probably not going back to regular school ever, but they all wanted to start blogs or podcasts or YouTube channels. Like this was where their natural abilities, their interests, and all these things lie. But that's very hard for someone who's, and it's sad to say because you mentioned privilege earlier, myself as well. In all of their cases, they're struggling with things like poverty. They've maybe never even eaten well in their life. Now they have a baby. They're also facing criminal charges in another case, like all these other struggles. And so trying to make figuring out that journey a little bit easier for them was the genesis of this show, because I didn't know what the heck I was doing. So I have to go out and interview someone who's started a business in the topics that they're interested in. And naturally, it's become this show that is really on that topic as online creators who are also lifelong learners. All this to say, for those people who are wanting to start out, but maybe don't have the background yet, what are things that you feel like if you shared would help maybe shave some time off of that learning journey?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. So one is like, don't put the pressure to go full-time on this initially. Like it is perfectly okay and reasonable to have this be like a hobby that you do for an extended season. I mean, as I shared, it was like literally, just I kid you not, like literally was breaking down, removing 1 hour after, 1 hour after another. Like as, I started making more income, just because like, and maybe it's part of it's like my like immigrant mindset where, I gotta be like super conscious with money on everything. But so that'd be one thing. And then two, find people that are going and doing what you want to do. Right? So it could be somebody local. It could be a YouTube channel, right? Whatever it is. And this just sounds like really, I hope it doesn't come across as like shallow advice, but like, I think now as I get older, I realize how important it is to have mentors, but not just mentors that are teaching a skill set, but mentors who are living with the values and the life that you want to live. I mean, like practically for us, right? As parents, we can't do the hustle and grind 24/7 work weekend. Like, no, we've got sick kids. We got to pick up, we got to drop offs. Like there's stuff like that. So I would rather find mentors like that are sort of navigating that.
The thing that helps me with that, although like anything, it's like I can tell the positive, helpful advice. And there are times that I still struggle because I'll look at another creator really crushing it with their podcast or what have you. But the thing that pretty much helps 90% of the time for me is just to focus on the you versus you mentality. But again, not pushing myself too hard, because I certainly used to, pull all-nighters to create something or whatever, because that was the schedule that I set for myself, and recognizing that I made all of this up, and I mean, just really appreciating, as kind of woo-woo-y that it sounds, that like all of this doesn't matter at some point relatively soon, and it's interesting for me. I create with this painting behind me. A lot of the times I have kind of two little studios I use, but my dad made this painting. It has both of my younger brother's ashes in it. They died at 32 and 34 years old. And the background of my phone is their tombstone, where they're both on the same grave. And it's that, and then being a parent. And I know I've heard you mention before that your daughter was born premature, same as ours. And I think they were pretty much the exact same birth weight, if I remember you. Anyway, she was born, in our case, 3 pounds, and, spent a few months in the hospital and those kinds of things. And all of this stuff just really does put it into perspective. The fun thing for the youth that I work with is they have that perspective. They've literally had their house being shot at, or they've had to raise their siblings when they were only 13 years old themselves, and all of these kind of wild stories, or were homeless. And it's kind of neat because it gives them that perspective very young. It's just, can they get through that adversity to then be successful? And I feel like one of the things that they really do struggle with in a practical way is figuring out sort of those real world pieces of like, how do I make money doing this? And there's a million different ways. That's the good news. The tough news is a lot of people kind of hide that information. So when you mentioned that you were taking hours off of your blocks once you were able to, what were some of those first parts of your journey where you're like, oh, I can actually make money doing this?
My recommendation, or at least what's worked for me, is don't start with like a product, like a digital product initially. So don't go directly into online courses. So either do one of two things. So either do like one-on-one coaching, or do some sort of like I think the term is like what, productized service, right? Like if you are really good at YouTube editing, right? Like offer that as a service. Yeah, I heard a great, I wrote it down for our chat, so I'm going to just like refer to it because I heard a great quote from Ali Abdaal recently. And he said, get going, get good, get smart, and that's sort of the 3 stages of, I mean, he says it for like YouTube growth, but I think it's the stage of entrepreneurship as well. So you learn the most when you're actually in the arena, right? And what's the easiest way to get in the arena if you're still figuring stuff out? I mean, I would say like either do one-on-one or some sort of like productized service.
And then for you, that became courses and productizing things a little bit more. So when you referenced Mastermind, what does that look like for you now? Is that a membership? Is it what's the business model for you now?
Even just to take a step back, so I started with one-on-one consults because when I launched my podcast, colleagues were reaching out and they were like, "Mel, how did you do this?" And I was like, "Oh, I wonder if this seems like," and this, Justin, I know you probably resonate with this, but like part of this journey has been working through a lot of money stuff for me, and this intersection of money and self-worth. So I charged $200 an hour, right? Which was about what I was making, like $400 in eval, and the evals would take me about 4 hours to write. So I was making about $100, right? Which is a lot of money. But I was like, I want to see if I can double that. So I started with the, one-on-one consults, and then the folks I did the consults with, I threw this idea of an online course and if they would be beta testers. And then I kind of went from there. So then the online course became a podcasting course for therapists. I learned a lot. It's done unbelievably well. We've had 273 students go through it. We just passed 316,000 in revenue off of that course. So I just thought, there's some potential there, and that hasn't been like a hockey stick up growth. It's been a lot of like this. But the idea for the mastermind came because I realized, so a couple of things. When the pandemic hit, I think a lot of therapists were so slammed and so busy, and they were dealing with their own pandemic trauma while hearing story after story. And I think a lot of therapists started asking, like, how do I shift and start to see this as a skill set? And so I knew that I could tell like online courses were on the radar. I got very lucky again because I didn't connect the dots, but I had been creating a course and been growing a course. I had that sort of credibility built in. I think about this a lot, which is like stacking skills, like doing the thing, teaching the thing, doing the thing, teaching the thing. So the mastermind is where that came from. And that itself has been a 3-4 year journey. I started at $97 a month or $9.97 a year because I was just so scared no one would buy. Had some wonderful colleagues that went through it. I also had colleagues that, dropped out and like disappeared. And I learned a lot from that. And now we've upped it to $750 a month. Yeah. So it went to, I think, $297 maybe, then $497, and then $750 a month. It requires a 1-year commitment. I've been like sitting a lot with like, what is my enough number? So I literally ran our numbers and I was like, okay, this is, with my partner's, again, the privilege of this, right? Like with my partner's salary plus what, I sort of bring in, I need about 12 to 13 members to be profitable and enough, right? And 35 would be like the ultimate aim, which I think would be 26,250 a month. But then, in revenue. So I follow profit first. So I want to have about 30 to 40% of that expenses. So 15% taxes. So I'd be paying myself 40 to 50% of that.
I think it's really neat when people share the behind the scenes of revenue. It's something that I've thought about doing in terms of building in public, although I feel like I would maybe regret it in the future, not because it grows and grows and then people are like hitting you up for money or things like that, but just in general, again, I think it can slightly become a distraction from what I want my, theme to be of what I'm creating. So I toy with that idea. I've also not formally sold things. So there's that too, where it's like, well, everything right now is just going out, which would be kind of interesting to show people. But for me, again, it's just a distraction.
Yeah. I hear you on this. And this is like a tension that I navigate a lot. And also because it's weird because I'm traditionally like a private person and it feels really weird to show numbers. And then I struggled with it. I was just like some weird flex. But then I started thinking about like videos that I've watched too, where like once I felt like I felt a connection to that person when they were sharing stuff. I didn't see it as a flex. I saw it as like them trying to be just genuinely helpful and helping me avoid like mistakes. And so that's sort of the perspective that I've taken. The thing I wanted to share is, so right now we just launched over the weekend. So we have 7 of our existing members who are continuing. One of our members that I've had a call with is confirmed. So we have 8 members, and then I've done 10 more calls. I'm waiting to hear back. And the reason I share that is because I'm not aiming actually for 35 now. I put a cap of max 25 this time. And the reason is because I talked to 2 friends recently. So one friend is an executive coach. Another friend runs a 7-figure web design agency. And with the friend that runs the 7-figure agency, I asked them, and they went from like 200 to 400 to I think like $1 million and then to over $1 million a year. I asked them, like, do you regret like that kind of money, right? Because money changes people, right? And he's like, no, like it is good. He said the biggest thing they regretted was that they grew too fast, because it compromised their health. And they had a number of health issues because, again, in the online space, we talk about revenue, right? But we don't talk about the compromises. There was some like immune issues and, all of this stuff. So what they decided to do was they called it a 15% rule, which is they say year over year, we will not grow more than 15%. And I was like, oh, that's really smart. So that's where I set my goal of 20, max 25 this time, because that would be around that 15% goal. And the executive coach friend, they said, Mel, you have to remember in all business, there are periods of growth, and then there needs to be seasons of stabilization of that growth. So you can't just grow, because like you have to make sure that you give your systems times to catch up. You have to give your body time to catch up and all of that. And I was like, oh, that just seems so much more of a sustainable way to build
I'm okay with that for sure. It really makes sense. It's a really special thing to share because it's a high IQ level of patience, which is definitely something that's hard to appreciate when you're starting out. And again, you're like, okay, well, that's fine, but I need to get to 100% first. And then from then I can go year over year at a clip of 15. I know we're going to have to wrap very soon. I have a couple theme questions I like to ask. We'll definitely have to run it back in the future because well, I have 100 questions that I would like to ask and we don't have time for them. But, kind of going deeper into a few of these topics, especially being a girl dad, that's something I thought we definitely would have been chatting about today. There's so much to that. As much as it's a buzzword, on the internet, girl dad, I think there's a lot of really, really helpful stuff. So we'll definitely have to do this again. One thing that I wanted to ask before the theme questions, though, was you referenced a colleague of yours who was teaching sports psychology on the weekends as part of her skill set that she was able to connect to scaling, as we put it. Which made me think of something. I often, almost every day, have to stop myself from starting a newsletter on the psychology of golf because it's just a really big interest of mine, but as are a million things. I also think that it would do really well in the marketplace. And it would simplify things. I could just write and publish and write and publish, and it would really, really simplify things. But the reason I say I have to stop myself is because this show is important to me and it needs to prioritize and have that one thing. But I do have that brain that thinks of a million different ideas. Like if someone couldn't think of a business to start, that'd be good for me to hop on a call with them and be like, here's 1,000 that you could start. So I'm sure you have some ideas though. So if you were to let the horse of your brain run wild, what are some other ideas that you're not starting?
Oh man, that is a great question. I've wanted to do like retreats for a long time. I've wanted to write a book for a long time. That will happen. It's just I'm pausing it because my plate is sort of full. I'm really into landscape photography.
That's cool.
Yeah, so I would love to do like trips to exotic locations and let's photograph this waterfall or Yeah, I think those would probably be the biggest ones.
That's awesome. I appreciate you sharing. I've often, one of my ideas is doing a podcast where this is all we do for an hour is talk about ideation because a lot of us, that's another thing that's common is that we have so many cool ideas that just talking them out, even if they go nowhere. Like I know James Altucher publishes his idea sex list. I think every day he'll share ideas that he has, 10 ideas. It's part of his practice. To just do that every day as a podcast, you just coming up with ideas and talking about them. I always thought would be kind of neat. Anyways, when you mentioned the book quickly, me too. And it's funny because I always thought that I didn't want to write a book because I don't like how people write a book as a business card, so to speak, as like lead gen, top of the funnel idea that I'm going to write this book, then people are going to know me for this. And so I avoided it. But then I fell into learning from some really good online writers who I find have a perfect balance. They'll do like the really big, meaningful deep dive. They're not using AI. They're actually writing it, and it takes maybe years to create. But then they'll also write mini books that are very helpful in the more the how-to space. And so for me, I'm actually working on 2. And it's funny because I've wanted to make books for 20 years, but I will. There's no reason now like that I'll create these 2 books on podcasting and they'll be out by the fall, which has kind of been a nice freeing thing,
Yeah. That's amazing. That's amazing. I mean, I think the thing is, the biggest thing we can do is give our gifts and share our gifts with the world, and there's a great quote that I often think about, which is, what may be ordinary to you, Justin, is like extraordinary or even life-changing to someone else, and just owning that. And people like us, I feel like we're grounded enough, right, in who we are. Like, I don't know, I had that same fear you did, which is like, I would become this like pompous, like a-hole, like, whatever, right?
A lot of people far wiser than I have given me that exact advice on this very show. And I feel like I'm getting better at taking it, but that in itself is a journey of learning. I want to be respectful of your time. So just to do these like rapid fire theme questions very quickly. And then, like I said, we'll have to run it back. But the first one is something that you yourself are learning right now that may or may not surprise people.
How to make hummus.
Cool. Cooking. I love this question. That's such a fun one. And one piece of advice, if you were to only be able to leave one piece of advice for the next generation, I know being a girl dad, this would be close to your heart. What's one piece of advice that you would leave?
You're never going to regret the times that you have with your kiddos when they're young.
And if you were to grab the mic, you're a podcaster, so you often have the microphone anyways. You asked me a question, what would it be?
What lights you up?
Besides seeing my kids figure something out that they really wanted to learn, found challenging and overcome, like this whole thesis of just keep learning, but seeing my kids do it would definitely be that at first. And then second to that, I would say creating this podcast, but to elaborate a little bit more is when sort of the triangle between you sharing a lot of this incredible information and knowledge and wisdom, and we discuss these topics. Of course, I hear them, but that's so just back and forth that when an audience member takes something from this, whether they apply it or not, but it gives them a moment of learning and appreciating something that they learned and that they could apply to their life, that really lights me up more than I can put into words, but I tried. And the final thing is, if people want to go support or learn more about your work, where and maybe why should they go?
Yeah, so I share my journey as a girl dad, as a psychologist, making this transition to online creator and podcaster and course creator. These days, I'm primarily writing on LinkedIn, and that's probably the best way to connect with me.
Well, as I said at the top, I know taking an hour out of your day to make something with somewhat of a stranger on the internet takes sacrifice, to use a word. And so I want to say thank you, and I really appreciate it, and definitely look forward to doing it again.
Thank you, Justin. And I really am just so grateful you reached out, and look forward to round 2 when that happens.
100%.
Have a great day.
Awesome.
JKL listeners, thank you so much for being here. I believe greatly in having the courage to speak our own goals out into the universe. And one of my challenging goals, it's been such a grind from the beginning as well, but it's amazing to keep going, is to help millions of people achieve their own dreams with this show. So please do continue to pass it along. Thank you so much to today's guest, Mel. He's built an incredibly powerful business and continues to show us how we can be a good person along the way. He also shows us that with solid systems, we can maintain our mental health along the entire journey too. As always, we love getting your DMs and comments about the show. If you have any input on guests or topics, please don't be shy, just let us know. Until the next episode, all the best, and remember, just keep learning.
You're one step closer to making your big dreams come true, but there's plenty more where that came from. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode, and if you know anyone who might love the show, send them a link. We'll see you next time on Just Keep Learning with Justin at Just Tries.